You had this poll, Trump is leading amongst all of the his contenders or opponents in the Republican 2024 presidential race. And so in that, I thought very importantly, you're seeing a record number of Republicans from Florida actually coming out in full endorsement of President Trump. You've had Paula Luna and recently Byron Donalds, Matt Gaetz, and also Rep. Corey Mills. And I just wanted, I think in this context of understanding what Trump represents and why the fight for President Trump in 2024 to retake the White House was explained beautifully in the endorsement statement of Byron Donalds. And I just want to read this statement. It's very short, but it really captivates this idea that we were discussing around leadership embodying, needing to be embodied both in a leader, a presidential leader, and in the population as well. And so let me just read this to you. He says, quote, in 2024, presidential election is uniquely important because Americans will decide the direction of our nation's future. At the center of this decision, voters must determine the commander-in-chief who is best equipped to lead our country and stand in the breach, putting themselves on the line with a willingness to sacrifice everything to save our republic. 2024 isn't simply an election, it is an inflection point in our nation's history, and it is an inflection point in world history. Goes on to say, look around right now. Our economy is a mess. Inflation is making life unaffordable. Our families, unaffordable for our families. Our borders have become completely insecure. Our justice system has become an injustice system. Foreign leaders test our mettle and are pushing us toward the brink of World War III. Far too many Americans have simply given up hope and even lost their faith. I refuse to accept this as our future. This is America, the greatest nation man has ever known. At the toughest moment in our history, leaders have stepped forward and seized the moment. Not just anyone, but truly transformational figures with the resolve and determination to rise above the chaos and inspire a generation of Americans to follow their lead against seemingly insurmountable obstacles. There is only one leader at this time in our nation's history who can seize the moment and deliver what we need to get back on track, provide strength and resolve, and make America great again. That is why I'm honored to endorse President Donald J. Trump for president in 2024, and I ask my fellow Americans to join me today. And I think that's a very important endorsement statement. And so we'll continue to come back to that and take questions. And thanks, Tony. I'm glad you were able to join us here.
Yeah, we had a power outage here.
All right, so go ahead. And you can go ahead and start.
I will. And thanks. You're a trooper. Thanks for all your help here. With the indictment of President Trump last week, many people are beginning to say this is not politics any longer, or it's not just politics any longer. It's something else. What is it? And people beginning to ask that question. And I'm going to try tonight to begin to provide an answer. With Trump's indictment, it's not just politics anymore. It's something else. What is it? And to answer the question, I'm going to be using the content from a wonderful book of Lyndon LaRouche dated 2004, which was called, the book was Earth's Next 50 Years. This is an earlier edition. The current edition is available on Amazon. The book contains two long book-length studies by LaRouche, and I'm using one of them, not the one called Earth's Next 50 Years, but the one called The Coming Eurasian World, also 2004. A tremendous study by Lyndon LaRouche, which I can't recommend it too highly. And I'm not going to be, it wouldn't be possible in this context to meaningfully tell you what he says, but as a whole, but I'm going to be drawing on some of what he says, which is uniquely appropriate to this moment. I'm going to be drawing particularly, as I said, the book is called The Earth's Next 50 Years. The paper I'm using is called The Coming Eurasian World, and I'm drawing especially on chapter 1, which is called Cultures Unfold in Long Waves. And the place LaRouche begins there is with the spectator at the theater of a great tragedy. And this is the spectator way up on the highest balcony in a cheap seat. But from up there, he looks down on a period of history quite unlike his own. People thinking in a way that they don't think in his world outside the theater, acting the way they don't act in his world. But he looks down at them. He looks into their minds. He sees out through their eyes, and he sees from a higher perspective. And this is the purpose of the tragic playwright. He sees from a higher perspective than any of the characters on the stage, including great leaders of that time and place, as 8 days ago, Bob Ingram used Shakespeare's tragedy, Julius Caesar. Here, the character high up in the balcony, when the lights go out, the curtain rises, he sees from above Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, Mark Antony, and the others. He sees out through their eyes. He sees from a superior point of view and sees, as I say, into a different period of history. And he sees what? He sees the struggle which they're engaged in, but not with other people, not with each other. That's not what's going on in a tragedy. Len compared tragedy with his work for many decades as a management consultant. And his job as a management consultant was go into a failing firm where nobody, typically in a failing firm, nobody knew why the firm was failing. In fact, when he was going in, they would say to the first person he met in management would say to him, well, I'll tell you one thing, it isn't. It isn't X, it isn't failure to introduce a new model. It isn't the bookkeeping department. It isn't this. He would know whatever they told him it isn't. That's the first place to look. The reason the firm is failing is because the people are blinded. They don't know what's going on. They're blinded by the system which tells them what to see, not what they see with their own eyes. They're blinded by the system. The management consultant, his job is to grasp right as soon as he goes in. He's got to do it within the first 2 days. The system that has entangled all these people, like the sculpture of Laocoon, if you know that. The system that's telling these people what to see, telling them what to think, dictating the failure of the firm. The same in the tragedy. The spectator up there in the balcony must see through the eyes of all these players interacting, they think, with each other, but actually they're all interacting within the grasp of the overarching system, which is the reason the society is failing. In Julius Caesar, the society is going down the drain. In King Lear, they're all completely different, but they're all the same in that respect. What you see is the system. And it's for this reason that, as LaRouche said, and as Friedrich Schiller said before him, that this theater goer in the uppermost balcony seat can emerge after whatever it is, 2 hours, a better citizen because he has seen the whole from a point of view that it really has to be tackled, which the characters in the tragedy, and that's why it's a tragedy, they can't do because they're in the middle of it and they can't see it. So that's the place to start. That's the place LaRouche starts in that chapter. And where he goes from there is, let's go to a particular tragedy shown in Athens. The exact year is not known, but first shown in Athens someplace roughly around 460 BC, which is Prometheus Bound, the second tragedy of the trilogy of Aeschylus, the Prometheus trilogy. The Prometheus, the fire bringer, the second Prometheus Bound, which we'll be discussing, and the final one, Prometheus Unbound or Prometheus Freed. And what this tells is that Zeus, the supreme god, aka Satan, in this case, the supreme so-called supposed deity, actually representing the chief bandit of the oligarchical families, the chief bandit of the oligarchy. Zeus has decided that humanity should be exterminated and replaced with another species that he's going to create. He's no longer wants anything to do with humanity. He wants to get rid of us. And Prometheus alone steps in to preserve mankind's existence. And the way he does it, as I'm sure many of you know, the way he does it is capsulized in what the playwright refers to in the myth which he was drawing on as the gift of fire to man. That fire is the mother of all arts, meaning by arts, sciences, and everything else. Science, metallurgy, pottery, cooking, you name it. Everything we do depends on fire. It's a characteristic of our species from the earliest times. I mean, many anthropologists say, if you go to a site which has skeletons of hominids, i.e. creatures which appear human from their skeletons, and you ask, were these human beings or not? Look for a hearth. Look for the use of fire. Only man uses fire. All animals flee from fire. Man uses fire. It's a unique distinction. And of course, I mean, fire is very special. We've developed fire through the eons into, coal, coke, petroleum, natural gas, nuclear fission, nuclear fusion, and someday the controlled fire of matter-antimatter reactions. So fire is basic to our culture, to our civilization, but it represents even something more to Aeschylus and the play Prometheus Bound. It represents the fire of the mind, the fire which is thought. A thought like fire, if you think about it, it's a process. What's the material? Fire doesn't consist of material. Fire is a self-developing process. Fire is obviously not thought, but in that respect, of the many things in the external world to remind us of thought, there is fire. And what Prometheus means is, I unleashed mankind's creative thinking. Mankind as a creator in the image of God, through his mind, which is the image of God. I mean, what is us? What is it meant by the image of God? It's not the physical likeness of God. It's the spiritual likeness of God, which is the creative intellect in which man resembles God, in which man uniquely relates God. So this is what Prometheus brought, and thereby saved the human race, and for his part was sentenced to be tortured on a rock in the Caucasus in Aeschylus' play for tens of thousands of years. So this is the tragedy which LaRouche would have us see from that balcony, because this represents the fundamental character of human civilization as distinctively human, and it represents the origin of Western civilization. In the Prometheus myth, the Promethean personality, the Promethean individual, the dignity, sovereignty, inviolability, the sanctity of the individual, which stems from that, and as the extension of that, the sovereign nation-state republic. Now, there were no fully sovereign nation-state republics until the United States was formed in the 1700s. But nonetheless, the drive toward the fully sovereign nation-state republic has been intrinsic to Western European civilization from days long before Aeschylus' play. It's just that we can't say too much about those very early days. The drive toward the kind of republic which was formed here in the United States in the 1700s was with us from the beginning of this Western, what we call Western civilization, or later Western Christian civilization. Now, the point of the chapter, and one of my larger points here is LaRouche's title, that civilization develops through long waves, that long waves with ebbs and flows and intervals of terrible, destructive, dark ages in those long periods, long waves of ebbs and flows. This was known to Plato. I mean, this is in Timaeus, his astronomical dialogue of the creation of the earth. I mean, there he portrayed long waves of growth of civilization punctuated by terrible, destructive dark ages which wiped out everything. And that this had happened repeatedly to mankind, even in his time and even before his time, because he's reporting this through the mouths of Egyptian priests who keep histories going far before the history of Greece, as the dialogue makes clear. So this, and that's where we have to situate ourselves now, all of us, in the wake of that indictment. I mean, as I say, in the top balcony of the theater and in the long wave of struggle for advancement of Western civilization, because that play was shown in Greece 460 BC, perhaps sometime around then. But not long after it was shown, Greece and Greek civilization was destroyed in the Peloponnesian Wars. And when Greece never again regained a leading role on the world stage after really participating in the birth of Western civilization. Greece was effectively destroyed, for 2,500 years or so. I mean, it exists, of course, today, but Greece, as the leading light of civilization, was destroyed. It destroyed itself in the Peloponnesian Wars, which were, as I discussed in an article recently on our website, Peloponnesian Wars, which were instigated by the Babylonian Persian Empire, which had failed to strangle Greece in the course of the so-called Persian Wars. So, I mean, we had the collapse of Greece in the Peloponnesian Wars. We had a rebirth of Greek civilization through the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 300s BC. And then again, a relapse of the Mediterranean into savagery, barbarism, depopulation under the long, long reign of the Roman Empire. Again, a Roman Empire, which was, partly also a Babylonian empire and an empire of faction in Egypt. It wasn't simply Roman. But under empire, the Mediterranean was dragged back into barbarism, savagery, depopulation, massive depopulation of the Mediterranean. And at the same time, we had the revival of civilization in the form of the Christian revolution against the Roman Empire, which transformed everything, for all of human history into the present and into the future. We had the Christian late Roman Empire, the so-called Middle Ages, the reaching a catastrophe with, again, the collapse of the oligarchical financier empire of Venice in the 1300s. It collapsed into a new dark age, famine, depopulation. Europe may have lost a third of its population. Lyndon LaRouche used to say half of the parishes in Europe ceased to exist. And then out of this dismal dark age, a good portrayal of it, by the way, for those of you who love Edgar Allan Poe, he wrote a short story, King Pest, which took place in Britain at the time of the Black Death, which was also the stage setting of Macbeth, of course, was in Scotland. So out of that so-called New Dark Age of the 1300s came a revival in a fuller form and a deeper form of Christianity in the Great Renaissance, beginning in Italy, and of course, which spread throughout Europe and which shaped our entire world with a new depth of culture and a whole new form of Christianity, a new degree of responsibility of the faithful, of the believer, which we hearken back to today. And again, we had the first, in the impetus of the Renaissance, we had the first attempts to create sovereign nation-state republics in the monarchies of Europe, the France of Louis XI, the England of Henry VII, who was very much influenced by Louis XI and these French developments, only to be decimated in the savagery of the 30 Years' War from 1616 to 1648. Again, all of these wars provoked by empire and by empires, and really ultimately provoked by empire and by empires against us, against our civilization, what we justly identify with today, and what we identify with today in the week after the indictment of President Trump. And then, a recovery from that devastation. And here, you had the 1700s revival of civilization, marked most important by the American Revolution, which inspired everybody in Europe and really in the world more broadly, even than Europe. But simultaneous with the American Revolution, as again, I alluded to this in a recent article, you had in 1763, the Treaty of Paris, the establishment of the British Empire as the premier empire of the world in 1763. So simultaneously, the British Empire was the world primary leader. All the other empires that, to the extent they survived, the French, Spanish, Portuguese, they were simply underlings for the British Empire. And at the same time, you had the greatest antagonist of the British Empire ever imagined right here, English-speaking North America, in the United States of America, the British Empire's greatest enemy, against which it struggled every day, never ceasing since then, through subversion, through kindling wars on the European continent, once the British had to give up the hope of subduing us militarily here in North America, when their Confederacy, which they had created, sponsored, and paid for, lost the Civil War in 1865. So, I mean, over that intervening period, and speaking very roughly, over the period, the long period, with many other things happening in it, intervening between the American Revolution and the year 1900, the British Empire was the most powerful force in the world, without question. But at the same time, for various reasons, nation states, in whatever form, with some degree of sovereignty, and some degree, going back to the Prometheus myth, some degree of freedom to pursue scientific progress, which, if you look back on it, that's what Prometheus gave us in modern terms, the freedom to pursue scientific progress. Zeus insisted we be barred from scientific progress. Prometheus came and gave us the gift of the ability for scientific, but also artistic and other kinds of progress. So nations existed, and to some extent, they pursued science. To some extent, they were sovereign, but a British Empire cast a dark shadow over the entirety of the human race, and not merely in Europe, but of course all over the world. Now, Lyndon LaRouche always referred to the year 1900 as a downward inflection point into a new dark age. I mean, many things were going on. The British the British Empire was waging its war against science. It was waging its war against culture. It was waging its war, of course, against South Africa. It was effectively waging war against France in Africa. It defeated France in Africa. LaRouche was especially really noteworthy in connecting what people had never done before in the same way, connecting the struggle in science, the struggle in music, in culture, with the struggle in politics and economy. I mean, the British Empire, which by this time, 1900, had long based itself on Adam Smith's denial of the distinctive characteristics of man. Adam Smith's denial, alongside the ancient legendary Olympian Zeus, Adam Smith's denial that man is created in the image of God. He said man is motivated properly by his immediate instincts, not by his human spirit, not by the divine in man, the divine spark in man. Adam Smith denied that. So this British Empire was pursuing a war, not only against the United States, the idea of republicanism, but a war against science, a war against culture. And there were critical turning points in those wars around the year 1900, which LaRouche has noted. And I mean, I'll say this without much explanation given the time, but in the year 1900, there was a Paris mathematics conference, which proposed world prize questions in mathematics. And the man posing the questions was a famous German mathematician whose name escapes me after my power outage. Lynn referred especially to his sixth question, which was to axiomatize physics, which means to take physics, Hilbert, the guy's name was Hilbert, to take physics and reduce it to a system of axioms and postulates like Euclidean geometry. So that if you had maybe 20 postulates, or however many, 20 axioms and postulates, once you wrote all those down, all of physics could be deduced from those. In fact, I mean, today it could be deduced by a computer. So in effect, you could lay down axiom and postulates for physics, and nothing was ever allowed to happen in physics which violated those axioms and postulates. So that was called Hilbert's sixth question. And LaRouche pointed to that as a signpost on this turn downwards from 1900, because that is the end of science. It's saying that nature is not, it's saying that nature is not creative. It's saying that God is not creative. It's what Aristotle said. But it's with that, 1900, that we began the 20th century. At the same time, in 1897, the last great classical composer, Johannes Brahms, died. Now, Brahms was well aware of the kind of problem I'm discussing with you. It's clear from his life, especially his life in those last years, because he was desperate. And he did everything conceivable to ensure that the tradition of Johannes Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Mendelssohn, Brahms, Schubert would not end with his own approaching death. He was a very sick man. And a then young man named Gustav Jena wrote an amazing diary. I'm sure you can obtain it somewhere if you want to, of Brahms took him on as a formal composition student. And I mean, formal composition was a formal course. It really wasn't much creative about it. But the reason, and Brahms never did this with anybody else, just with Jena. But the reason he did it was he hoped to fashion this man into a classical composer who could continue that tradition. He invited Jena in to live with him. I mean, there's astounding, funny anecdotes about the whole thing. Similarly, the Czech composer, Antonín Dvořák, Brahms became aware of him long before meeting him, read his compositions, sponsored him to win prizes, did all kinds of things, and then sent a letter to Dvořák in Czechoslovakia and Bohemia, which said, I have a lot of money. I have no heirs. I can take care of all your needs. You should move to Vienna into my house. And Dvořák figured he couldn't, that he couldn't leave Czechoslovakia, although he did later leave it to come to the United States, but he just couldn't leave. His wife broke down and cried over Brahms' letter. But, that was the end of it. That was the last great classical composer. The British subversion of culture, about which we could talk much more, succeeded. So I mean, that brings us into the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, since then, we've had, of course, World War, I finish up briefly, even though it's a lot of years. Since then, we've had World Wars I and II. We had the Great Depression, we had World Wars I and II. We had tremendous destruction of Europe by the British, triggering those wars, World Wars I and II. We had a recovery of the United States in the wartime into a great industrial power. To some extent, that continued into the 1950s, into the 1970s, into the early 1970s. But with the assassination of John Kennedy, with the British-inspired cutting off the gold reserve backing of the US dollar, going into a system of free-floating currencies, we've had the British Empire reemerge to a ruling role in the world during my lifetime. Since the 60s, since the 1970s. The US dollar has become not a US dollar. Most US dollars are created overseas. The US dollar has become a British imperial dollar controlled by the British-controlled international central banking system. And from there, I mean, now we're coming into, you know, the lifetime of more of the people who are on this call. I mean, in the wake of the unpegging of the dollar, the so-called then free trade policies being introduced under Reagan, increasingly under Clinton, the deliberate deindustrialization of the United States by our presidents, Clinton and others, Clinton, Bush, Obama, the taking down of our whole scientific potential. Then, I mean, it's just painful to go on because, you know, more and more, we've all lived through this. The needless war after needless war. Why did we have all those needless wars? These needless wars, beginning with Vietnam, going to Iraq I, Iraq II, Syria, Libya, all these, Kosovo. What was the target of these needless wars? The target was first and foremost the United States, the leading opposition to the British Empire. So now, you know, down, 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 and down, right? But then the first presidential term of Donald Trump, 1917 through 1921, 2017 through 21, was a breathing space. He was dead set against the policies I've named. He managed to certainly halt their advance. He managed even to reverse them in some cases. And now we're here with, you know, a man in the White House who doesn't know where he is most of the time. I mean, a bunch of whiz kids who know nothing. I mean, that was, you know, that was Kennedy's big problem. He brought us the whiz kids, Walt Whitman Rostow, McGeorge Bundy. These were the guys who, you know, were responsible for killing of 60,000 Americans and probably 2 million Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. But then when Biden comes in with the whiz kids, I mean, these guys are never made whiz kid. They're the dumbest, blinking, winking, blinking, and nod. So they have manipulated us into a rush into World War III. And I mean, the United States is rushing into World War III, both with Russia and with China at the same time. I mean, this is widely known. And I mean, everybody on this call better know it, because we have top people in our military and our intelligence agencies who know it just the way I'm telling it to you. They know it. That's why this recent leak of top secret papers, because we have guys at the top of our establishment, military industrial intelligence establishment, who recognize we're plunging headfirst into World War III. And then, I mean, if that doesn't get us, we have the green mafia. I mean, this is, and we've discussed it many times, I mean, this is the British Empire of Prince Philip, Queen Elizabeth, and of course, Prince Charles, or King Charles III, the present king, is the greenest of them all. This is the British Empire that came in around our governments. I mean, what government has decreed that we're not allowed to emit CO2? What government has decreed we're not allowed to have gas stoves? What government has decreed cutting off our oil and gas exploration? This was done, admittedly, Biden has done some of it, but this was done around governments by supranational agencies like the Conference of Parties of the United Nations. What is the Conference of Parties of the United Nations? It's governments. Governments are allowed to be in there. So are NGOs. What are NGOs? NGOs are creatures funded by the foundations, which is the British royal family and the financiers. So the COP, which gave us the Paris Agreement and all these farces, is a bunch of financier oligarchs consulting with themselves and pushing down on humanity the very same thing that Zeus did on humanity in the Prometheus myth. you're not allowed to use fire. You're not allowed to use fire, AKA civilization. So they're shutting off the tap. So we're at a very late stage of this. And when Donald Trump says 2024 is the last chance for the United States, he's not kidding. It probably is the last chance for the United States, and not just the United States, because the United States is the leader, like it or not. I mean, you know, you have a lot of lefties who want to see it otherwise, but the United States is the leader. If the United States can't stand up against this stuff, if the United States can't reverse this tide, who can? Nobody can. Russia can. China can. The United States. If we do it, we have support, as we already know. We have help. But if the United States won't do it, nobody does it. So that, I mean, just to try to finish by addressing the question I began with, after the indictment last week, people are saying this is no longer politics, it's something else. What is it? And what it is we are building the leadership, we are recruiting the leaders to lead the next great long surge of human progress. That's what this is with Donald Trump. Thank you.